The fire crackled in the center of the village, casting flickering shadows on the faces of those who had gathered. The night was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the distant hoots of owls echoed from the depths of the forbidden forest. The villagers sat in a wide circle, their eyes fixed on the old man who sat closest to the flames. His face was wrinkled, his skin the color of the earth, and his voice carried the weight of generations. "This river," he began, his voice a whisper that made the children huddle closer to their mothers, "is not like any other." The villagers listened in silence, their expressions a mixture of fear and reverence. The old man was Elder Kojo, the keeper of stories, the guardian of the village's oldest secrets. His words were never to be ignored. Many moons ago, Kojo continued, a woman heavy with child stood at this very river, much like the women do today. But she was never seen again. A few of the younger ones gasped, but the elders remained quiet, nodding solemnly. They had heard this tale before, passed down from their own parents and grandparents. She was beautiful, the old man went on, staring into the fire as if he could see the past within the flames. Her name was Adana, and she was soon to give birth. But she made one mistake, she wandered too close to the river after dusk. A hush fell over the gathering. The river was sacred, but it was also feared. No one stayed near its banks once the sun disappeared behind the trees. It was an unspoken rule, one that no one dared to break. They say, Kojo's voice dropped lower, forcing everyone to lean in, that the spirits of the forest do not like to be disturbed. They watch, always watching, from the shadows of the trees. And if they are displeased, he paused, letting the silence stretch unbearably long. They take what is most precious. The wind stirred the treetops, and the villagers shivered despite the fire's warmth. "What happened to Adana?" a young girl finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kojo sighed, his eyes dark with memory. She was seen standing by the river, staring at her reflection. Some say she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Others say she was listening, as if the river itself was whispering to her. A few of the villagers made protective gestures, murmuring prayers under their breath. And then, Kojo continued, his voice almost lost to the night wind, "She vanished." "Vanished?" a man scoffed, though his voice trembled. "She must have fallen in." Kojo turned to him, his old eyes piercing. There were no ripples in the water. No footprints leading away. Just emptiness. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. Even those who doubted spirits and curses could not explain how someone could disappear without a trace. The next morning, Kojo said, his voice now barely above a murmur, her husband found something near the riverbank. A piece of cloth, torn from her dress. And next to it, a handprint in the mud. But it was not hers. Silence. The kind of silence that weighed heavy in the air, pressing against their chests. Kojo's gaze swept over the villagers, his voice turning grave. Since that night, the river and the forest have not been the same. Those who wander too close, they feel eyes upon them. Some hear whispers, calling them by name. And some, he exhaled slowly. Some never return. A shadow flickered beyond the firelight, and a few villagers turned their heads sharply, their hearts pounding. But there was nothing there. Only darkness. Kojo leaned forward, his face grim. Remember this well. The river is sacred, but it is not kind. It remembers those who disturb its waters. And the forest is always watching. A gust of wind rushed through the trees, making the leaves whisper like voices in the dark. The fire flickered, casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. And beyond the firelight, deep in the heart of the forbidden forest, something stirred. Something that was listening. Something that was waiting. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. The village was alive with the sounds of daily life, women pounding yams, children laughing as they played near the huts, and the occasional bark of a stray dog. But Nia heard none of it. She stood at the edge of the river, her hands resting on her swollen belly, whispering a quiet prayer. "Jomo," she murmured, "where are you?" Her voice was barely louder than the rustling leaves around her. The water before her was still, its surface reflecting the darkening sky like a polished mirror. Jomo, her husband, had left for the city months ago, searching for work and a better future for their family. He had promised to return before their child was born, but the days turned to weeks, and the weeks into moons. And still, there was no sign of him. Yet, Nia refused to lose hope. Every evening, she came to the river, placing her hands on her belly, speaking words of protection over the life growing inside her. She believed the river carried messages, that it could reach places far beyond the village. If Jomo could hear her, somehow, she prayed he would return. A soft breeze swept through the reeds, making them whisper against each other. Nia exhaled slowly. "You should not be here so late." The voice startled her. She turned to see Mama Kwesi, an elderly woman with a back slightly hunched from years of labor. She carried a bundle of herbs, her dark eyes filled with concern. "You know what the elders say, child," Mama Kwesi continued, glancing nervously at the trees that stood like silent sentinels beyond the riverbank. "The spirits wake when the sun sleeps." Nia forced a smile. "I am not afraid, Mama." "You should be." The older woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Have you not heard the stories? The forest is not just trees, and the river is not just water." Nia sighed. She had heard the tales 100 times. How the spirits of the lost roamed these lands, how the forest could swallow those who walked too far, how the river could take more than it gave. She wanted to believe these were just old stories meant to keep children from wandering, but the unease in Mama Kwesi's voice made her stomach twist. "Come, child," the old woman urged. "Let me walk you home." But Nia shook her head. "I will stay a little longer." Mama Kwesi hesitated, then sighed. "Stubborn like your mother, you are." She turned to leave but paused. "Be careful, Nia." As the old woman disappeared into the village path, Nia turned back to the river. The wind had stilled. The water was too calm. A sudden rustling in the bushes made her tense. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around. Nothing. And yet, she could have sworn someone was there. The next morning, Nia went to the well to fetch water, her heart still unsettled from the night before. As she lifted the clay pot onto her head, a boy no older than 10 ran up to her, breathless. His name was Tund, a mischievous child always full of stories. But today, his eyes were serious. "You were at the river last night," he said. Nia frowned. "And how do you know that?" Tund hesitated before whispering, "I saw you." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "I also saw something else." Nia's fingers tightened around the pot. "What do you mean?" Tund looked around again before saying, "The last time I saw a woman standing at that river at night, she never came back." Nia's skin prickled. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Tund swallowed. "My sister." Silence stretched between them. It had been years since the vanishing of Tund's sister, Adana, the same woman Elder Kojo had spoken of by the fire. No one had ever found her. No footprints. No body. Nothing. Nia forced a smile, pushing aside the creeping fear. "I will be fine, Tund." But the boy didn't look convinced. As he walked away, a shadow seemed to pass over the village, brief but chilling. Nia shook her head, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. That evening, despite the warnings, despite the fear creeping in her bones, Nia returned to the river. The sky was darker than usual, thick clouds blocking the moon's light. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. She placed her hands on her belly, closing her eyes. "Jomo," she whispered. If you can hear me, come home. The water rippled. She froze. Her reflection wavered, distorting in a way that the wind alone could not cause. A soft whisper drifted through the air, barely audible. Nia. Her breath hitched. She spun around. No one was there. The trees stood still. The village lights flickered in the distance. She turned back to the river. And saw a figure standing behind her reflection. Her scream caught in her throat. When she whirled around, there was nothing. Just the whisper of the wind and the endless, watching trees. The river remained silent, as if it had swallowed a secret it would never give back. The air was heavy that evening, thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant promise of rain. The village had settled into its nightly routine, fires crackled in the hearths, mothers hummed lullabies to their children, and men returned from the fields, their bodies aching from a long day's work. But Nia felt no peace. Something was wrong. She couldn't explain it, but ever since the night at the river, a strange weight had settled in her chest. The feeling of being watched had not left her. Every rustle of the wind, every shifting shadow seemed to hold unseen eyes. Still, she went back. She had to. Jomo was out there, somewhere, and she would not let fear stop her from calling him home. As she reached the river, the sky was painted in hues of deep purple and orange, the last remnants of sunlight fading. The trees loomed in the distance, dark and unmoving, their gnarled branches twisting into shapes that almost resembled hands reaching for the sky. Nia placed her hands on her belly, whispering her usual prayer. Then, she heard it. A voice. A soft, breathy whisper drifting through the trees. Her heart pounded. It was too faint to understand, yet unmistakable, it was calling her name. Her breath quickened. She turned sharply, scanning the forest's edge. The trees stood silent. The wind had stopped. But she wasn't alone. Somewhere, just beyond the tree line, a shadow moved. Her skin prickled. The figure was there for only a heartbeat before it melted back into the darkness. Nia took a step back. Then another. She forced herself to breathe. Her mind raced. Was it just a trick of the light? The wind playing games with the trees? She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Something was watching her. The next morning, Nia went to see Elder Abina, the village's oldest and wisest woman. If anyone could make sense of what she had experienced, it was her. The elder's hut smelled of dried herbs and burning incense, the air thick with the scent of protection spells and old magic. She sat on a woven mat, her eyes closed, as if she had already been expecting Nia. "You have seen it, haven't you?" Elder Abina said before Nia could even speak. A chill ran down Nia's spine. I don't know," Nia admitted. "I heard whispers. And I saw something." Elder Abina's face darkened. "You should not have gone to the river," she murmured. Nia swallowed. "I only went to pray." "The river listens," Abina said. "But so does the forest. And it does not forget." Nia's hands trembled. "What does it want?" The elder's eyes bore into hers, filled with something ancient, something knowing. "It wants what it has always wanted," she said. "To take. To claim. To pull into its depths and never let go." Nia's heartbeat thundered in her ears. "Listen to me, child," the elder continued, leaning forward. "Do not enter the forest. No matter what you hear. No matter what calls your name. Do you understand?" Nia nodded. But deep inside, she knew the forest had already chosen her. And it would not stop calling. That night, Nia lay awake in her hut, staring at the woven ceiling above her. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard whispers. Every time she tried to calm her racing thoughts, she saw shadows moving just beyond the edge of her mind. Sleep did not come. And outside, beyond the safety of the village fires, the forest whispered her name. The wind howled through the village, bending the tops of trees as dark clouds rolled across the sky. The air was thick with the scent of rain, heavy and suffocating. A storm was coming. The villagers hurried to secure their homes, tying down baskets, bringing in the livestock, and whispering to one another about the strange stillness that had settled over the land. The storm should have brought movement, rustling leaves, and the scent of wet earth, but instead, everything felt wrong. Nia stood at the edge of the river, oblivious to the growing whispers around her. She had ignored Elder Abina's warning. She had ignored the fear that clawed at her belly, whispering for her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not tonight. Not when she felt the pull stronger than ever. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, her heartbeat in sync with the low rumble of thunder in the distance. Her reflection stared back at her from the water, pale, wide-eyed, and filled with something she couldn't name. Then, behind her, the mist thickened. And from it, something emerged. A figure in the mist. A chill ran down Nia's spine before she even turned around. The air dropped in temperature, colder than the storm itself, as if the very breath of the river had turned to ice. And then, she saw her. A woman stood in the mist, barely visible but impossibly clear. Her skin was ashen, her body thin, too thin, as if life had long since left it. Her hair was long and tangled, dripping with water, though there had been no rain yet. But it was her eyes that made Nia's blood freeze. Hollow. Empty. Watching. A gust of wind swept through the trees, making the branches groan like old bones. Nia took a step back. The figure took a step forward. Nia tried to speak, to ask who, no, what, she was, but her lips wouldn't move. The figure tilted its head, its mouth opening ever so slightly. And then, it smiled. Nia's breath hitched. She wanted to run. She needed to run. But the river was behind her, the figure before her, and suddenly the air around her felt too heavy to move through. Then the whispering began. Soft, like wind through leaves, but wrong. Twisted. Nia. Her name. Over and over, spoken by many voices at once. Come home. Nia clutched her belly, shaking her head. No. The whispering grew louder. Come. 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 She squeezed her eyes shut. And then, with a voice that sent pure terror through her bones, the woman in the mist spoke. Your child is ours. Nia's scream tore through the night. The villagers were inside their huts when they heard it, a cry so sharp, so full of terror, that it silenced even the wind. Mama Kwesi dropped her cooking bowl. Elder Abina sat upright, her bones aching with a warning she had hoped would never come. The storm had not yet begun, but a deeper storm had already arrived. Nia. A group of villagers rushed toward the river, their torches flickering in the growing wind. The darkness of the approaching storm swallowed the trees, making them look like tall, faceless figures reaching for the sky. By the time they arrived at the river's edge, Nia was gone. The water was still. Too still. The mist had lifted, yet the air felt thick, suffocating, like something unseen was still there, watching. Only one thing remained, a piece of fabric. Torn. Damp. Caught between the roots of an old tree near the water. It was from Nia's dress. The villagers searched all night. They called her name. They sent men with torches into the forest, even though their fear was greater than their courage. But there were no footprints. No sign of a struggle. No ripples in the river. It was as if Nia had simply ceased to exist. And from the depths of the dark forest, the whispering continued. But now, it carried laughter. The village was awake long before the sun. Fires flickered in the early morning darkness, casting long shadows against the mud brick huts. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers to the ancestors. The air smelled of damp earth, but it was not the coming storm that made the people uneasy. It was fear. Fear of what had happened to Nia. Fear of what took her. The men gathered at the riverbank, their faces set in deep lines of worry. They searched the shoreline where Nia had last been seen, but the ground was undisturbed. There were no footprints leading into the trees. No drag marks on the soft earth. No sign of a struggle. The water was calm, too calm, as if it had swallowed its secrets whole. She must have drowned, one of the younger men muttered. Mama Kwesi shook her head, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The river does not take without a fight, she said. If she had fallen in, the waters would have returned her body. Elder Abina stood near the edge, her gaze locked on the dark forest beyond. She is not in the river, the old woman murmured. Something else took her. A shudder passed through the crowd. The spirits. The cursed forest. Nobody dared say it aloud, but everyone was thinking it. Then came Kofi the hunter, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes as sharp as an eagle's. He had spent his life tracking animals through the wild, unafraid of dangers that sent other men running. I will go into the forest, Kofi announced. A murmur of protest rose at once. You must not. Mama Kwesi cried. You know what the elders say, another man warned. No one enters that place and comes back the same. Kofi ignored them. If she is alive, we cannot leave her, he said. And if she is not, his jaw tightened. Then we must know what happened. The silence that followed was heavy. No one wanted to go. But no one dared to stop him either. Finally, two men, Jabari and Kojo, stepped forward. They were younger, less experienced, but they carried torches with shaking hands and nodded. We will go with you, Jabari said, though his voice was not steady. Kofi nodded. Without another word, the three men turned toward the trees and stepped into the forbidden forest. The moment they crossed into the trees, the air changed. It was colder, even though the storm had not yet broken. The wind did not move through the leaves. The sounds of the village faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Jabari swallowed hard. I don't like this place. Keep moving, Kofi ordered. They walked in silence, the torches casting flickering light against the ancient trunks. Every so often, the men thought they heard whispers, faint and distant, but when they turned, nothing was there. Kojo stopped suddenly, pointing ahead. Look. There, tangled in the roots of a tree, was something pale and torn. Kofi rushed forward, pulling it free. It was a piece of Nia's dress. But it was deep inside the woods, far beyond where she had last been seen. How did this get here? Jabari whispered. The wind picked up, rushing through the trees like a breathless voice. And for the first time, even Kofi felt afraid. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more unnatural everything felt. The trees stretched impossibly tall, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The air was damp and thick with something unseen, something watching. The torches flickered violently, their flames struggling to stay alive. Even Kofi, who had hunted in the deepest parts of the wilderness, felt the wrongness settling into his bones. Then, Jabari stopped in his tracks. Wait, what is that? He whispered. Kofi turned his gaze to where Jabari was pointing. His breath hitched. Carved into the bark of a massive tree were symbols, strange, spiraling marks that looked almost like eyes. Kojo moved closer, running his fingers over the grooves. These are old, he muttered. Older than the village. They looked around. More trees bore the same markings. Some were shallow, freshly carved. Others had been there for decades, their edges softened by time. Jabari's voice shook. What do they mean? A gust of wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper. Kofi's grip tightened on his spear. We need to go back. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more unnatural everything felt. The trees stretched impossibly tall, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The air was damp and thick with something unseen, something watching. The torches flickered violently, their flames struggling to stay alive. Even Kofi, who had hunted in the deepest parts of the wilderness, felt the wrongness settling into his bones. Then, Jabari stopped in his tracks. Wait, what is that? He whispered. Kofi turned his gaze to where Jabari was pointing. His breath hitched. Carved into the bark of a massive tree were symbols, strange, spiraling marks that looked almost like eyes. Kojo moved closer, running his fingers over the grooves. These are old, he muttered. Older than the village. They looked around. More trees bore the same markings. Some were shallow, freshly carved. Others had been there for decades, their edges softened by time. Jabari's voice shook. What do they mean? A gust of wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper. Kofi's grip tightened on his spear. We need to go back. A hush fell over the room. Kofi clenched his fists. You mean, pregnant women? Mama Deka nodded. This is not the first time, she said. Long ago, another woman, just like Nia, vanished the same way. Kojo's eyes widened. Who was she? The old woman's face darkened. Her name was Zuina. She was carrying her first child when she was last seen by the river. Jabari felt a chill creep up his spine. What happened to her? Mama Deka's lips pressed into a thin line. She heard whispers from the water, she said. And she answered. Kojo shook his head. That doesn't make sense. If she fell in, wouldn't we have found? She was never found, Mama Deka interrupted. Just like Nia. The fire cracked loudly in the silence that followed. Then, from outside the hut, the wind shifted. And through it. A voice carried from the river. Nia's voice. The villagers froze. Every man, woman, and child heard it. A soft, trembling whisper, carried through the wind like the rustling of leaves. Help me. Jabari's face turned pale. Did you hear that? The voice came again, clearer this time, and undeniably Nia's. Please. I'm here, in the water. The village erupted into chaos. Women gasped. Men rushed toward the river, torches raised high. Mama Kwesi clutched her chest, whispering frantic prayers to the spirits. Kofi was the first to reach the water's edge. And what he saw made his blood turn ice cold. The river, calm, black, endless, was shifting. The mist above it curled and swirled, forming a shape. A woman's face. Nia's face. Her lips moved, though the sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Kofi, help me, please. Jabari and Kojo stood frozen beside him, their faces drained of color. That's impossible, Kojo whispered. She's. He couldn't finish. Because in that moment, the water rippled. And a hand reached up from the depths. A woman's hand. Soaking. Pale. Unmoving. And just before it vanished beneath the surface once more. They heard something else. Something that made their very souls tremble. A soft, eerie laughter. Coming not from the river. But from deep within the forest. The river was silent. The only sound was Kofi's breathing, ragged and uneven. His heart pounded, every muscle in his body screaming for him to run. But he couldn't. Wouldn't. Because Nia was still down there. Without another thought, he threw his torch aside and dove into the water. The cold hit him like a slap. The river was deep, deeper than it should have been, pulling him into its shadowed belly. He opened his eyes, but all he could see was darkness, a vast, endless void stretching in every direction. Then, a flicker of movement. Something pale beneath him. A shape. With burning lungs, Kofi kicked downward. And then, he saw it. A jagged opening in the riverbed, a cave entrance, its edges worn smooth by time. It was wide enough for a person to slip through. Or be dragged through. A force pulled at him, not the current, something else. Something that wanted him to see. So he went inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the water around him grew still. The cave was silent, its walls rough and lined with strange carvings. The symbols from the forest. The ones that warned of something ancient. And then, Kofi saw them. Bones. They were scattered across the cavern floor, some whole, some broken. Some small, too small to be adults. Kofi's stomach churned. This was not just a grave. It was a feeding ground. And then, the temperature dropped. Something was behind him. He turned, heart hammering against his ribs. A figure stood in the water, barely illuminated by the dim light filtering from above. A woman. Nia. His breath caught in his throat. Nia. She was floating, her body weightless in the water. Her dress swayed gently, her long hair drifting like black tendrils. But something was wrong. Her skin was too pale. Her lips did not move, yet her voice echoed in his mind. Why did you come? Kofi felt his stomach drop. He stepped closer, reaching out, but then, he saw her eyes. Empty. Hollow. Not a trace of life left in them. This was not Nia. This was what the river had turned her into. Kofi stumbled back, choking on rising panic. What have they done to you? Nia's head tilted, her expression unreadable. Her voice was barely a whisper. They change us. Behind her, the bones shifted. Something moved within them, slithering through the remains like a thing made of water and shadow. Kofi realized, too late, that he was not alone in this place. The others who had disappeared. The other pregnant women. They were still here. Watching. Waiting. The river did not simply take life. It consumed it. Changed it. And now. It wanted him, too. Kofi stumbled back, choking on rising panic. What have they done to you? Nia's head tilted, her expression unreadable. Her voice was barely a whisper. They change us. Behind her, the bones shifted. Something moved within them, slithering through the remains like a thing made of water and shadow. Kofi realized, too late, that he was not alone in this place. The others who had disappeared. The other pregnant women. They were still here. Watching. Waiting. The river did not simply take life. It consumed it. Changed it. And now. It wanted him, too. His lungs burned as he kicked toward the light above, the whispers growing louder, angrier. The water clawed at him, invisible hands grasping at his legs. Then. With one final push. He broke the surface. Gasping, choking, he scrambled onto the riverbank, collapsing onto the mud. The villagers rushed toward him, pulling him up, shouting questions. But Kofi couldn't speak. Because when he looked back, the river was calm. As if nothing had ever happened. And Nia was gone. The river was quiet. Too quiet. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Kofi, soaked, shaking, and gasping for breath, and the dark, endless water that had swallowed Nia. The whispers were gone. But something was still there. Watching. Waiting. And they all knew, this was not over. Mama Deka stepped forward, her old eyes filled with a heavy understanding. The river will not stop, she murmured. Not until we end this. Jabari wiped his damp face. And what? We don't even know what we're fighting. Mama Decca's gaze drifted toward the towering trees beyond the water's edge. We are fighting a hunger older than us all. Kofi clenched his fists. Then how do we stop it? The elder hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she said the words none of them wanted to hear. We must break the curse. A ripple spread across the river's surface, as if it had hurt her. The villagers shuddered. No one spoke as Mama Decca began gathering the things she needed. The ritual she was about to perform was ancient, whispered only in secret among the elders. Because to confront the curse meant risking everything. A fire was lit at the riverbank. Around it, symbols were drawn in white ash, the same strange markings found in the forest. Mama Decca knelt before them, her voice low, murmuring in a tongue older than the village itself. The wind stirred. Then. The river reacted. The once still surface churned violently, waves thrashing against the shore as if the water itself had awakened in fury. The sky darkened. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Jabari grabbed Kofi's arm. This is madness. We should run. Kofi didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on the fire, on Mama Decca's trembling hands as she poured a dark liquid into the flames. A thick, black smoke rose from it. Then. A voice. Soft. Heartbreaking. Familiar. Protect my child. Kofi's breath caught. His chest tightened. The villagers turned, eyes wide, searching. And then, from the mist rising off the water, Nia appeared. She was standing at the river's edge, just beyond the firelight. Not fully here. Not fully gone. Her form flickered like a dying flame, her face pale, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with something else, pleading. Kofi stepped forward. Nia. She lifted a trembling hand but did not touch him. Could not. The curse must end, she whispered. Tears stung Kofi's eyes. Tell me how. But Nia only shook her head. A gust of wind howled through the trees, the storm swelling, raging. The fire shrank, its flames barely holding on. Then, Nia's gaze dropped, to her stomach. Kofi's breath hitched. The whispers. The disappearances. The curse. It had never been about just the women. It was about the children they carried. Before Kofi could speak, the river roared, waves surging toward them. The fire flickered once. Then died. And Nia was gone. Forever. The storm breaks. The villagers collapsed to their knees, shielding their faces from the howling winds. Then, as suddenly as it began, the storm stopped. The air grew still. The river returned to its unnatural, eerie calm. The trees ceased their whispering. And for the first time in generations, the village knew the curse had been broken. But at a cost. Kofi stared at the empty riverbank, his heart aching. Nia was never coming back. But her child would live. And he would protect them. No matter what.